My parents taught me that God, if he existed at all, was not intimately involved with us or with the world around us. We expressed our Jewishness through involvement in social causes and a concern for justice. These were integral to our lives. God was not. I pondered questions of life about mortality, whether or not there was such a thing as eternal salvation. I grew up in a typical New York, post-immigrant, liberal, egalitarian Jewish family. And I even understood as a very small kid that this was like a civilization. And it was a civilization different than what was outside of Judaism, what the Gentiles believed, what they did, how they behaved. My grandparents and their siblings were all from Eastern Europe, and they spoke Yiddish. The new Americans had animated discussions about politics, philosophy, art, and science against a background of great opera and classical music. My parents believed that it did not matter if one was a Jew, a Mormon, or a Catholic. What other people thought of or did about God was nice but insignificant. Any belief was fine, so long as people realized that theirs was no better than the next person's. I was too young to really understand a lot of that and be able to synthesize much of it, but as I grew older and then started experiencing world outside of just, Flatbush, New York, Brooklyn Judaism, I started to realize that, this God did exist and that he did care about us and he did influence us. As for Yeshua, I first recall thinking about him when I was around 13 years old. I had read The Passover Plot by Dr. Hugh Schoenfeld. Schoenfeld's book was a serious scholarship and quite simply settled any questions regarding Yeshua. He was not the Messiah, and that was that. I had no further interest in him for several years. I faced a possible diagnosis of leukemia or Hodgkin's disease, and while I was in the hospital, I pondered questions of life about mortality, whether or not there was such a thing as eternal salvation. I declined seeing a rabbi who I felt at the time I had little in common. Instead, I befriended a cleric named John Valenzano, who would come to my room and speak with me about spiritual issues. I'll never forget the time he took to spend with me. I didn't realize then what a spiritual effect these visits would have on me. I managed to survive the 60s and I set off for college. I arrived in Kansas City, Missouri, sight unseen. I quickly realized that I was not in Brooklyn anymore. In my dorm room for all of 2 hours, a fellow named Gary Henke entered with an open New Testament. He wanted to tell me about Jesus. At the same time, the Jesus freaks hit Kansas City, and I thought they were overbearing and obnoxious. Consequently, I had several discussions with them in the cafeteria and elsewhere. Needless to say, I was always right, at least in my own eyes. Then I went to medical school at the Midwestern University in Chicago. There, I encountered a professor named Dr. John C. Lee. Despite being a Gentile Christian, he was an examiner at an Orthodox rabbinical school in Chicago, where he reviewed doctoral theses, etc. He knew a great deal about Judaism and Jewish customs. My admiration for him led me to believe that faith in Yeshua must be more viable than I had previously thought. I told him that if Yeshua was good for him, he was good for me. But his response was astounding. He told me to look to Judaism for the answers I was seeking. I gained far more religious training and involvement in Judaism than my parents would ever have dreamed of. Yet instead of finding answers, I felt my efforts were futile. I was doing the right things according to Jewish practice, but none of the laws or minutiae had brought me any closer to God. I sensed that despite my best efforts, I was not pleasing him. I grew more and more discouraged. I met Kim, a beautiful, Gentile, humble Christian woman who frankly refused to argue with me about her beliefs. I tried hard to persuade her that she was wrong about Yeshua, but she would have none of it. As our relationship grew, I began attending her church, mostly to keep her company and to prove that the gospel was ridiculous. I listened carefully to the sermons, waiting for the pastor to say something that was anti-Semitic. But he never did. I heard about forgiveness and love, redemption, and the way to escape God's wrath. I found I was actually stimulated by the preaching. We proceeded with a minimally Christian wedding. I continued searching for proof that Yeshua was not the Messiah, even more so as we were expecting our first child. We did not discuss how we would raise our children, but my concern about it added urgency to my need to resolve the question of Yeshua. During her pregnancy, the movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, was released, causing a firestorm of controversy. I do not recommend this book or the movie, yet God used them to open my mind and heart to see that Yeshua was more than I had been willing to admit. It pointed out an essential truth. Man cannot become God, but God can become a man. As I watched my daughter Lauren come into the world, I thanked Yeshua. It was a spontaneous utterance in the delivery room, and I spoke it without even realizing it. I was truly startled. I thought somebody behind me said it. I looked around like, who said that? I suddenly felt a presence that was new to me and yet very familiar. I now know that was the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit. I was excited, but not outwardly. I knew that I had much to learn. He is the God who saves, not only physically, but spiritually. The Father sent Yeshua to dive headlong into this world to rescue humanity. If you call upon him, he will answer.